Okay, so we are starting the next session. As it is evident, I am not Professor Riccardo Palumbo, but unfortunately it's been delayed a bit, so I will chair this session. We have, of course, the problem is that we have so many interesting contents, and clearly the problem is to keep up with the short time, but we'll try to make the most out of it. So in this session in particular, we will have several presentations that I think cohere in many different respects. I'm very happy to give the floor to start with to Laura Fontanesi from Affective Advisory Basel. Laura, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So actually I'm from Zurich now, based in Zurich, okay. But it's fine. Yes, so today I wanted to give a slightly different perspective than what we've heard earlier. So the perspective is the one of applied behavioral science for policy and business. Ah. Okay. Così? Okay. So we start from this idea that throughout our senses we receive a huge amount of information. So that's been estimated to be around 11 million bits per second. But ultimately, what we can consciously get out of that, it's much, much, much smaller. So more or less in the realm of 50 bits per second. So the idea here is to say, okay, there was this old vision of humans, of coming from the classic sort of economic view on rationality, that sort of men are rational, and we are supposed to sort of get all this amount of information, make calculation, and then make rational decision above it. But in the 50s, there was a series of thinkers that sort of changed this view dramatically, and we started talking about bounded rationality. So we don't say that we're rational, but we say that we're rational given the limitations that we have. And these are limitations, again, that have to do with the fact that the amount of information that we process consciously is very limited compared to everything else that we are exposed to. Also, thinking about what happens today with like a lot of devices and a lot of information that we receive that is really also designed to grab our attention. This problem of like sort of thinking of how our brain evolved to only process a little bit of it, and how it is limited to some extent becomes very crucial. So what is applied behavioral science? What it is about? The idea is to help and empower people who struggle to reach their goals. So there's this idea of the intention-action gap. So perhaps your intention is to start exercising, go to the gym a number of times per week, but then ultimately you struggle to reach your goal. And well, we ask, why is that? We try to understand this, and then we try to sort of shape the context, provide the means, and all sort of interventions that could help people. It combines a large body of scientific research and methods, but also a lot of experience that now we accumulated throughout the years from practice in the field. And also it puts together very different scientific fields that look into human mind and behavior, starting from psychology, of course, so cognitive psychology, that's more what I've been trained on, for example, but also social, organizational psychology, neuroscience, behavioral economics, and social sciences. What it's not, I think this is also very important always to mention, because sometimes there is a bit of a wrong idea, I think, on what is behavioral science. It's not a magic wand, right, that sort of fixes people's problems. And it's also not something that you can apply out of the box just because you read an intervention in a paper, it doesn't mean that it would work in your specific context, or that even it makes sense to apply it, right? So I'm Laura Fontanesi. I didn't say that before. My background indeed is in psychology, especially economic psychology. So I did my PhD at the University of Basel, studying how people make decisions with the use of computational models. But now I moved to the applied field, working for Affective Advisory. We are a relatively small team based in Zurich, and also relatively young. So we started in 2017. And the nice thing, I think, is that we are quite mixed backgrounds. So as I said, I'm more like on the computational psychology, but there's also people who studied more like how to communicate and visualize data, and also other people who are more into behavioral science, but coming more for perhaps business or economics. So the way that we approach problems, so we haven't heard about frameworks, I think, but I guess most of you are familiar with some sort of framework, so it's nothing new, but this is also how we approach problems. So we have this pyramid that it's also the affective pyramid, and it has basically 5 steps, and it sort of reveals how we approach a problem. So it's, as I said, it's not just applying something to a context, but it's first of all defining the problem together with the stakeholders, doing research, which means often interviewing people, so really trying to understand what's going on, then designing an intervention, validate it, and executing it. And I think maybe, so everything could be, I could talk about it for a very long time, but I think maybe this could be interesting point that when you do the research bit, so when you're really trying to understand, okay, where is the problem, what's happening, then you really try to tackle very different levels. So there's the individual context, of course, that maybe that's the most intuitive, but you also have to look at the social context. So decisions are not made in sort of completely individually. There's also the environmental context. That's also often where the interventions then go, but also the digital context that nowadays is very important. And then there's also different levels at the level of, so from the cognition point of view, so you could, when you design an intervention, you could say, well, I want to stay at the level of triggers. So maybe people fail to do something because they just fail to pay attention to it, but maybe they're not motivated enough, they're not capable to do it, so they don't have the means to reach their goals, or they lack feedback. And then based on all this, you would design intervention that make sense in your specific case. The other idea is that, again, you don't apply things out of the box, which means that most of the time, so you would want to validate it in the specific context, following behavioral science methods, and also then when you want to then sort of scale it up, that's again a different level and a different kind of sort of problem. So as I did this sort of move myself of like doing research in academia and now doing it in the field, I thought it was interesting to give a little bit my perspective of what are the differences. So well, first of all, it's sort of the richness of the data that we have when we look at data in the real world compared to the lab. In particular, the kind of experiments that I used to do were like people in front of a screen choosing option A versus B. And now I'm more looking like how people make decisions in a supermarket or at work or choosing insurances and stuff like that. So it's very, very complex, which is a good thing and a bad thing. It gives you more validity, but it also makes things more sort of noisy and difficult. The testing process, I think it's quite interesting because I realized that while my purpose before was more like, for example, building a new theory, or finding a new effect, now the purpose has more to do with what it's feasible to do, what makes sense to do, and really sort of taking into account different stakeholders, that could be your client, but also ultimately really the people. The ethics is also different, just a stupid example, but it's not obvious that you could have always a control group, right? So that's not obvious because perhaps there are interventions that would be unethical to not implement on the whole population, right? But we know that from statistical point of view, it's like quite problematic, right? And then ultimately the statistical power. So that I find also a fascinating point, also because of my kind of more method-y mindset. But so basically what happens when you do research in the field is that sometimes you have not the freedom, for example, to decide your sample size. That also is to some extent true, of course, in academia. But then, for example, in academia, what happens is that even when a study is underpowered, you might have the luxury of saying, well, maybe this I don't publish, right? If it doesn't turn out well. So there has been, I say it because there's this study from De La Vigna and Linus who showed that comparing results from in the field and from academia, the effects that they found in the academic paper are much higher, but also that most of the studies were really underpowered, which means that there is a huge publication bias. This also means that when we are planning, so as practitioners, when we are planning based on the results that we read in the literature, it's also problematic because maybe I see there is a 8% effect, and I'm very hopeful. I plan my sample size on the 8% effect, but then really this was noise, and I don't find anything, right? So that's find very fascinating. And now, quickly, I wanted to just give a feeling of the kind of intervention that we might do. So the first one has to do with healthy eating. So this was basically for the canton of Zug in Switzerland, who has basically a group that tries to basically promote healthy eating. So what is the target? The target is basically the residents in this canton, and the idea is to implement interventions that can support them to eating healthier. In this case, specifically, was about increasing the consumption of vegetables. And the way this problem was approached is that the people at the supermarket were basically observed, and we try to understand where are the behavioral hotspots. So where are sort of like moments in which perhaps people pay more attention at what they're doing. So typically they look a lot in their shopping baskets. And based on that, we designed interventions. So for example, in the shopping basket, there was this little paper that says 1/3 of these baskets should be filled with vegetables. And then also different messages. So for example, what are other people in Zug consuming in terms of portion of vegetables, to sort of give them a reference, but also what experts suggest, but also just messages to put in to highlight vegetables that were more for that specific season. So with like kind of word plays in German to sort of motivate them to eat that specific vegetables. There was a website then that suggested recipes based on these seasonal vegetables, etc. And another quick example I wanted to give is this was for the Swiss Federal Office of Energy, and this was kind of a longer project. It started with creating a report on all the behavioral insights for demand-side energy policy. This was developed by, again, starting from understanding the problem, so doing interviews, for example, with a diverse sample of CEOs from small and medium enterprises, and integrating that with insights from research, from the literature, and then ideating this, that would be basically a catalog with behavioral interventions. So everything that could be done sort of more or less easily. So there were these graphs that would say, okay, what is the cost of implementing something? What is the complexity? What kind of expertise you need? And how much time it takes, right? So for different interventions, there was some sort of like this idea of explaining everything that takes to sort of implement this. And the other thing was working with their energy bills, so see if we could design them in a way to sort of like, again, sort of help the users. So in this case, they were small and medium enterprises to perhaps consume less energy. So here we used a few ideas, again, from the literature, but then adapted a little bit. So for example, one of the ideas is to say, you want to compare what you consume with what a similar industry consumes in the same field. And what was understood also is that people have a hard time understanding kilowatt per hour, right? So I also cannot really sort of make it very tangible, right, in my mind. So then the solution was, for example, to say, okay, with this amount of kilowatt per hour, you could drive a Tesla for I don't know how many kilometers. Obviously, it's Switzerland, and it's the target is very specific, so this made a lot of sense. Perhaps maybe a bit less for if you would target individual users, of course. And the other thing is that you would compare, so this would be a social comparison, right? What do I spend compared to other people similar to me? But there was also a personal comparison. So what do I spend, how much did I spend compared to last year, for example? Then there were stickers to sort of like the usual call to actions, start, I don't know, saving energy, stuff like that. And then also information. So you would have, again, a link to the website with definitely more information of what can you do in practice in terms of also implementing new habits. And then there was an experiment in which we sort of randomized industries from different categories of industries to a control group, intervention 1, 2, 3, so based on whether they only had the sort of comparison element or also the sticker. And I don't know how I am with time, but I think, okay. All right, good. So then I'm basically at the end. So this is also an example I wanted to mention. This is a publication we're working currently with in collaboration with the ETH of Zurich and the OECD. So it's a publication for the OECD about basically based on this map that we designed. And it's a map that should help practitioners, so either in policy or in business, but it was mainly targeted to policymakers when they have to design a study to test a behavioral intervention. So you have here different methods, and the idea is that this looks like a metro map. So each method is a metro line. You have different stations where you should stop after answering specific questions that ask you, okay, what can you do? What do you want to do? And based on that, you would be referred to so the most appropriate method for you. Then, yes, so these are the associations and collaborations that we have. So we're among the founding member of GAPS, that it's also an association for behavioral science. And we have also an applied behavioral science academy that it's really targeted to executives that want to learn about behavioral science and maybe start implementing them in their businesses. And then our clients are really like pretty much half and half with public and private sector. And the public would be, for example, as I said, the Swiss Federal Office of Energy, but also the BAG, so that's for health, again at the federal level, but also a lot of cantonal identities. And then more like private things, so would be, for example, pharma or insurance, etc. And thank you for your attention.
Thanks so much, Laura. There will be so much to discuss about this, so interesting. We have a time just for one quick question, if there is. Otherwise, because we try to manage the time as best as possible. So we move to the next, if I don't see, okay. We can move to the next presentation. So now it's Stefano Palminteri. Stefano, floor is yours.
Okay, so this is, I presume to change the slides. Great. Okay, so first of all, I want to thank the organizer, Riccardo, and especially Pier Luigi for the invitation. It's been really an enriching meeting so far. So today, I think I will present something a little bit different compared to the other talks that we have, because in addition, of course, to have an introduction, which I hope is going to be kind of general, I will go a little bit, I will dive in an actual study, and finally I will conclude. As introduction, so what I research in my lab is decision making. So decision making in neuroeconomics is often popularly represented with this integrative box and arrow method, right, in which an agent tries to make choice in order to maximize some sort of reward function. And there are different steps in this decision-making process that are relevant. So first of all, attribute some value to the option in the environment, then selecting among these actions. And when someone enjoy or experience an outcome, he can use this information in order to modify through learner the expectation in the following iteration. So this is often presented like something, really integrative, etc. However, when you look at the literature in decision making, things are a little bit more complicated. So here in blue, I highlighted the steps that correspond more to what we can define the prospective valuation step, right? So we have some options and we try to make an estimation of what is the value of these options. And then there is more in red here, a retrospective valuation part in which we try to retrieve from memory what was the value, the valence of this previous choice. It turns out that in the literature, these two things that are supposed to be part of an integrative framework are studied with very different tools, okay? So the red part, which is the learning, the experience part, is traditionally used with a framework of reinforcement learning or associative learning, right? So this is a typical task. The subject see some abstract stimuli, and don't be afraid, I will show you a more concrete example. And the choice are random at the beginning, and then thanks to reward and punishment, they converge to something. On the other side, the prospective part is often used, especially in economics, a paradigm where, which we call description-based paradigm, in which all the relevant variables, the probability, the outcome, etc., are almost verbally or explicitly stated to the subject, okay? So, in experience, we have learned the probability. They are described in description, abstract cues versus verbal and numerical cues, feedback, absence of feedback. A metaphorical representation of these two paradigms is often used. It's like the responsible learning tasks are called bandit tasks, like slot machine. We have to try in order to make some money. The description part could also be, understood as a sort of wheel of fortune in which some stochastic process will give you an outcome. It is funny to note how in decision theory, the gambling metaphor is always very important, actually starting from Cardano and Pascal, early exploration of belief formation. So the red part is how most neurosciences studies decision making. So basically, in humans, there is a little bit of both. But for example, when you study animal, you cannot do lotteries properly in animals. So the bulk of the research of the findings in neuroscience of decision making are based on the description-based paradigm. On the other side, behavioral economists, they mostly do experiments using the description paradigm. And there is a significant, but not dominant group of psychologists that try to integrate both. Okay. This is important because even when you think about one of the most robust results in behavioral economics, I think if one have to cite one result that replicate all the time is Kahneman and Tversky loss aversion. Their paper has been cited 78 times thousands times, so pretty unbelievable number of citations. And it embodied, it's actually computationally embodied this idea that we overweight loss compared to gain in prospective valuation. But for example, me and other groups has showed that when you do similar tasks in a experience-based paradigm or in reinforcement learning, you will actually find the opposite pattern, right? So this is problematic. You know, even if there are people working on this, these discrepancies are in generally understudied, so there is still an absence of communication between the fields and the practitioners, in our case, researcher, and also they are not fully understood, so we don't know exactly what are the computational and cognitive mechanisms that underlie these discrepancies. Okay, so the other idea that I have to introduce, and I think is more linked to the cultural part of my talk, is the notion of weird people in experimentation. So it has been already raised, evoked by several talks, the importance of doing cross-cultural studies. So this is true even at the fundamental level in psychology, because it is true that the biggest corpus of literature comes from weird countries, so Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic, which, as a matter of fact, represent a very narrow image of what is the human population. And this is far from being trivial, because even in perceptual decision-making, and this is the very simple basic illusion in which we have to judge how the length of a line, and the judgment, so the illusion is the one, the B seems to be longer. It seems to be really a simple process, yet you can detect inter-country or intercultural differences. Similarly, we observe the same things, also maybe more interesting for us, in economic decision-making. So these are results for economic gains, in which, in this case, you can implement a punishment. That is not the point, but again, the point is that even within countries that are supposed to be on the same plan on similar things, or for example, they are both members of NATO, etc., you can still observe significant difference in this kind of behavior. So these are challenges. The relative absence of these cross-cultural studies are challenges. First of all, from the point of view of scientists, because we would like to build is universal theories, right? Not local theory that apply only to my Paris population, do experiment in my lab. And also because then you want to apply behavioral science, so you want to have solutions that maybe work in general. And again, of course, there is a big literature on this, but it's relatively understudied, especially in the field of experience or reinforcement learning, which is my field of interest, okay? So with these two key ideas of interaction. So first of all, that decision-making is complex. So we don't have yet understood everything. And there is also this weird problem. So these are a little bit the two standing points of my second part, which is a case study that has been led by my senior postdoc, Hernan. And you can find the preprint if you're interested. Of course, the preprint contains much more details and information compared to those that I will be able to deliver here today, okay? So what we studied a lot in our lab is contextual influences, okay? So you can see it again is a perceptual experiment that show a visual illusion of context dependence, but we know that we have some sort of contextual influence also in more complex decision making. So the decoy effect being a prime example. You would not buy the $30 bottle in the case which is the top price, but then if there is a decoy, you will think, I don't know, $30 actually is okay, okay? So one of the main hypotheses that we've been testing in our lab is whether these contextual effects also apply to experience-based decision, to learning, to memory, essentially. To do that, we designed this study. Okay, so I will go step by step. So we are in the realm here of the experience-based decision. So it's banded. So you can see these two tiles represent two options, left and right. So you can pick whatever you want. They have different values. So for example, in this dark green case, the A option is the best because it is associated with a higher reward most of the time. The B option is the worst locally. Same thing can be said for the other context in which C is better than D. So the typical behavioral results when you expose a subject to this kind of task for several trials is that they learn to maximize, okay? So of course there is noise, nonetheless, there is a significant difference from chance, that is random choice would be 50%, in which you observe the subject pick A in AB and pick C in CD, okay? So this is not the surprising part. I would say that if we could not find this result, we would stop there because there is some problem, but so far so good. Then the trick that I invented is that now I create a new context in which I modify the pairs and I create new pairs, AD and BC. Of particular interest here is the combination BC, right? Because if you go in this context with an absolute, a rational choice, a memory of the absolute value, you should, from the normative standpoint, pick B, okay? But nonetheless, this is not what we observe. In this comparison between these two options, the subjects tend to pick the B option, that is actually, tend to pick the C option, right, the suboptimal one, which is the suboptimal one. So it's a context-dependent bias that creates irrationality, right? I think maybe to illustrate even more what is going on, I asked my students to prepare this. Could you click on the top of these two figures, please? The two ones in which there is T0 written, because they are filled. Yeah, thanks. Okay, so this is like very time-accelerated version of the task. The arrow is the choice of the subject, and the feedback is what the subject is receiving as feedback, okay? So you can see that, for example, in the left case, they will converge more or less to pick the black option that leads to 10 points more often, while in the other case, they pick the pink one, which seems to give to 1 more often. Then we do this recombination, okay? So we have the orange and the pink, and in that case, they choose the pink, despite the orange was several times associated to 10. And I think it's quite, I mean, when you see the task, you realize that how weird this results, not weird in the sense of the country, right? In fact, despite these many trials with this outcome, context affect very deeply the preferences. So we already published this, and this was realized in a perfectly weird sample, so mainly people in Paris, students, university students, and I asked whether or not these results was actually robust across country. So I asked, thanks to Erna that actually set up the experiment. We included in total 11 countries. Of course, we have a lower level of penetration in some continents, including Africa, but it's for us a first experiment, a first study, and I will come back to this. One of our goals is to extend even more this network. Nonetheless, we have a quite good spread in terms of different cultural parameters that just were also measured in our sample, and also in different macroeconomic and microeconomic feature of these countries. And we did the experiment that I show you, so the one with the reinforcement learning task, followed by the same decision problem, but presented in the form of lotteries. So, and I think that for the first time, we did an international cross-cultural study of experience and description preferences. So what we found in the reinforcement learning task, so this is again AD versus BD, we replicated very well the results that we had in the lab. So with some variability, but we will see much more small variability. So we could confirm that this context bias exists also, at least in the 11 countries, in the 11 samples that we tested. We also tested the same preferences in the explicit task, and we observed one thing, is that the preference here does not explain the preference in the reinforcement learning. So it's yet another instance of this experience description gap that show that you cannot generalize risk preferences, decision modalities across these two paradigms. So these are the main results. And there is also another important result. So here I will show you a result that is simply like an aggregate model-based measure of these results across the different countries. And what you will observe is that concerning the experience-based task, the spread across country is quite small, while concerning the description paradigm, the spread, the variability, so you can see the blue bars are larger than the red bars. So another important finding, I think, is that on the top of the qualitative difference, so in one case they prefer one option and the other option, there is also more cross-cultural variability in terms of the description-based paradigm. Okay, and now the take-home for this part is, yes, so we have a good stability of experience-based preferences, and yet another instance of the gap in terms of average results and also the variability level. Now let's come to the conclusion. So I will try now to maybe give a little bit more perspective on why we think these results are interesting, and also probably to some of people of this audience, okay? So, of course, this kind of cross-cultural studies has a fundamental scientific interest, right? So, if we want to discover again more or less universal principle, we have to do that. And I think that, for example, in the specific application that I show you, what they show is that reinforcement-based or experience-based effects are much more low-level, probably hard-coded, compared to description-based processes, which makes sense, but it has to be confirmed, that it has to be reminded. We can understand that, like, because this description-based paradigm will depend on the way people, their appraisal of probability, also how, for example, culturally taking risk is taken, because in different cultures it's cool to take risk, in others it's not cool to take risk, etc., etc. So this is, I think, the fundamental interest that, in general, international studies has, but in our case, concerning to our finding, this is really showing the difference between hard-coded processes and more variable, probably nurture type of thing. And I think, and even if it's not my field, but I think that this kind of finding is also important at the application level, right? So, because if one wants to inspire policies based on behavioral findings, and also maybe policies that can be translatable across countries, first of all, we need to have a good model of decision-making. One first take-home messages, we don't have yet a complete thing. We can back on this. Second point is that we have to be capable to say which kind of theory we're going to use to design my intervention, because not the same theory work in the same way, etc., etc. And finally, of course, it has been already reminded that one important, very important interest of these studies at the ethical level, so create a more inclusive science in terms of authors, but also participants, but also findings and representation, etc., etc. Okay, so of course, as I say, this is a first case study. It's a starting point. What we are going to do, or what we would like to do, is adding, of course, new countries, because we don't have, we will never have a full coverage, but we want to have a better coverage of different countries. Also, more strata, it is important to note, because we have countries, the socioeconomic stratification will change enormously what is the perceived culture of the subject. And also, of course, we will develop new tasks to continue on this idea. All this is made possible by, again, the intercultural cognitive network that Hernan created with some help from us and all these amazing people. It's something open, so as I said, we were going to deploy, I think, during summer or after summer, a new study, and we are eager to have people join the club. And actually, more maybe interest point of view, it's also something that if you have some idea about funding and create a more permanent infrastructure, because this is what has been done with in-house money, and this is kind of project that is not easily funded with the standard venues for research, be it the ERC or the INR in France. I think it demands something a little bit more dedicated for this. All right, so take-home messages. Concerning the introduction, what I want to show you that decision making is complicated. So here we are talking about applying results of the research to the real life, but keep in mind that we don't have a full-fledged final theory of things, including decision making. And other thing that I wanted to raise was the interest of doing these intercultural studies that beyond our specific results are as important, I think, to better our theories on one side, but also develop more effective, more likely to work strategies at the end. And yes, I like this. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Stefano. I will give the floor immediately to Stefano Pagliaro, and while Stefano gains his place there, I am saying that clearly there is also this stream of research that is not motivated immediately by, let's say, culture and the arts, but I think that this is exactly the kind of research that we are presenting in this session as an enormous potential of cross-contamination. So this is one of the reasons why it's so important to have also this kind of research here. Stefano.
Thank you very much. Thanks again. I echo the other speakers in thanking Pier Luigi and Riccardo for inviting me. Actually, I'm speaking in the name also of many other researchers who cooperated with me in this research line. Pier Luigi and Riccardo forced me to try to present my own research in a very different way that I usually do in the social psychology conferences, because I'm a social psychology, I admit it, I'm sorry, with a great interest in organizational processes. So I will try to explain how this may interact with culture to promote employees' well-being, reactions more in general, so in terms of attitudes, behavioral intentions, and well-being. If you have a look at the title, you can see the antecedents of, or what Manuel and I will introduce you Manuel in a while, believe is one of the main antecedents of the employees' well-being, which is the climate within the organization. That, of course, is part of the culture of the organization, which is strongly rooted in the morality, and I will come back to this in a while. The employees' reaction, so a plethora of reactions from attitudes to affective reactions to indicators of well-being, which we measured also over and beyond the boundaries of the organization. So, for example, in terms of personal happiness, not directly related to organizational well-being or classical organizational well-being indicators, and the social identity approach, which is our main theoretical framework. Yeah, I'm a fan of this approach, and I think that it can explain a lot of phenomena within the organization. But, you know, there is a guy who did all the work, but I got the invitation because I have the tie. So, Manuel Teresi, thanks for including me in your excellent work on the organizational ethical climate. Manuel has been a former student of mine, now is a cooperator to all the studies I'm going to present. So, basically, this research line started with my interest in morality. I've been studying morality as a group regulation tool until 2006, when I was a PhD student, and we can basically define morality within the thousands of definitions of morality as the distinction between what is right and what is wrong as a way to behave. And morality is particularly important as a group regulation tool because it defines the way we should behave in order to be considered as a proper group member, and also in order to predict how the other will understand and interpret our behavior and react to our own behavior. Therefore, when Manuel and I started using the concept related to morality within the organizational context, and now there is an excellent book by Naomi Elmers and Dick de Gilder, The Moral Organization, summarizing this evidence. We try to understand how we can depart from classical, theorization of organizational behavior as only driven by economic rewards, for example, right? So we know that there is much of philosophy here and much of the economic theory here. So we asked whether the salary, the benefits, so everything that you can imagine in terms of real rewards, how this kind of rewards can be compared to a different kind of rewards, which is not tangible, but which can produce really a trustful atmosphere within the organization. And we know from the social perception field that actually morality is the dominant dimension along which we judge ourselves, present ourselves to others, and judge the other and the group we belong to. So we encountered this fascinating concept of organizational ethical climates, which is not something that is fixed within an organization, as it approaches actually the concept of the group norms as theorized in social psychology, and we can define the organizational ethical climate as a set of shared formal and informal perceptions of procedures and policies which shape the way in which we think that the organization deals with ethical issues. So, for example, we can interpret an unethical behavior within an organization as, caused by bad apples, and this is a truly, individualistic way to interpret unethical behavior. Or we can imagine that we have the corrupting barrels. That is the climates of the organization that actually foster unethicality within or ethicality in the reverse within the organization. And of course, starting from the very basic definition, one can think that an organization can be, ethical or not. And this is a unidimensional interpretation of the ethical organizational climate. But Victor and Cullen actually showed that every organization can have its own ethical climate, which sometimes can be based on outcomes, for example, or in other case can be based on rules, as in many organizations, or in other case, again, can be based on the quality of relationship within the organization. Whatever the climate, it's important to understand that as morality is not universal, but is group dependent, each group has its own group norms and the way in which these represent guidelines for individual behavior. In the same vein, ethical climates can be different across the organization, and so every employee could have a more specific idea what the organization considers as moral, whether it refers to the culture of the organization. So many cultures of many organizations, for example, on the website, they present their vision, which is actually a number of ideals and values and norms that then translate into actual behavior on the way in which the behavior is punished or rewarded within the organization. Why it is important to study ethical climate, ethical organizational climate? Because by now we have abundant studies showing that it strongly influences the employee's reaction in terms of attitudes, for example, in terms of commitment to the organization, or behavioral intentions, for example, turnover intentions, or more generally speaking, well-being. And as I anticipated in my first slide, we relied to run this research line on a widely adopted theoretical paradigm in social psychology, that is the social identity approach, which basically, just to recap some tenets of the theory for those who are not familiar with social psychology, basically define that, an important part of the people's identity stems from the group they belong to. So I can be, for example, extrovert, and this is something that is relevant to my own personality, but I can be also a professor, right? And this is something that relates me to the group I belong to. And of course, my social identity is complex because I belong to many groups, and the context, time by time, define which group is salient in a specific moment, right? Okay. Why this is important? Because social identity approach has been fruitfully applied to the organizational context to define that the linkage, the psychological linkage between the employee and the organization actually has dramatically effects on employees' reaction. So in terms, for example, of commitment, in terms of reduced turnover intention, and in terms of well-being, as we can see in a while. So for example, in an influential meta-analysis some years ago, Nick Steffens and colleagues showed that the higher the organizational identification and the lower the stress, the higher the well-being, because people feel socially support within the organization. So we try to connect these two research lines, the one on the ethical climate and the other one on the social identity approach applied to the organizational context, to try to contribute to inform policymakers and even, companies on how to promote employees' well-being. And to do this, Manuel and I choose two specific climates. So, I think that the labels chosen by Victor and Cullen are not optimal, but regardless of the labels, the so-called friendship ethical climate refer to a vision of the ethical climate as featured by a collectivistic and an interdependent way to deal with ethical issues within the organization. And on the contrary, the self-interest one refers to a more individualistic one, a more individualistic way to interpret the ethical issues within the organization and to deal with it. So in several studies, we compare the effect of the perception of the ethical climates across these two kinds of climates on the employees' reaction. And our main hypothesis was that this should have been, mediated in terms of both statistically significance, but also in terms of psychological explanation by the linkage between the person and the organization as a whole, so the social identification. So basically our model is this one. I will not show you results, just paths. Is it good? Okay. So basically we predicted opposite effects of the two climates on the level of identification, and we predict that according also to the theory of the social identity theory, and higher perception of the friendship climate should be related to higher identification, and the opposite we expect for the self-interest climate. And then we expect the identification to spill over a number of positive outcomes for the employees. So this actually is the project roadmap of Manuel PhD thesis. And all of these studies have been published. So if you're interested in details, I can share with you the paper. Basically, in the first paper, we ascertained the association that we expected. So we sampled real employees, and we asked to report their perception of the climate within the organization, their identification, and two kinds of behaviors that are, usually assessed within the organization. CWB reflect the acronym of counterproductive work behaviors, so a number of behaviors that actually, are negative for the organization, for example, absenteeism. And on the contrary, OCB means organizational citizenship behavior, meaning with this a number of behaviors that actually favor the organization. For example, mentoring someone who is a new member of the organization. Then we added the leadership style, considering one specific leadership style, that is the distributed leadership style, which is quite close to the theory of the social identity. So it's a leadership style in which the leader actually and thoroughly engage the employees in defining their job and in making decision and whatever. So it's not just a fake engagement, right? And also we use the number of, we try to increase the number of outcomes in the direction of a positive experience of the workplace, right? This is interesting because, this kind of studies suffer, of course, the correlational problem. When you come to the real employees, you cannot manipulate the extent to which they interpret their own climate within the organization. You cannot force an employee to say that he or she believes that the organization is really friendship or on the contrary, self-interest. So together with Manuel, we designed a couple of experiments. Within the lab in which we asked participants to imagine that they are going to work for a company featured by one or the other climates. And once again, we even here, we found evidence for, here, a causal chain between the ethical climate, the level of organizational identification, and number of indicators of well-being. So, for example, the recommendation, which means the extent to which people would recommend to a close one to apply for becoming part of the organization, the turnover intention, of course, the leaving the organization. And shift is a variable by which we ask participants to what extent they would like to change the organization to join another organization featured by the opposite climate. We then move more directly to indicators of well-being. One of these in organizational psychology is the level of self-objectification, that is the extent to which employees perceive themselves more as object and then less human-like, like in the Marx theorization in philosophy. And once again, we found that ethical climate positively impact on the reduction of self-objectification through a higher level of organizational identification. And finally, since our theorization started from, the idea that identification stemming from the organizational climate should create a trustworthy atmosphere, we try to examine this causal chain featured by organizational identification and trust, which we called the organizational identification trust buffer hypothesis. So the way in which this may buffer against stressor and produce as a consequence, well-being. And as you can see, this chain enhances satisfaction, which is an indicator of well-being, and reduces the work tension. That is the extent to which your work problems are intrusive in your personal life. Okay. Just to briefly recap, we think that we show that climate as a part of the culture of the organization is critical in determining the way in which people perceive the organization and the way in which they experience the workplace in a positive or negative way. And this is strongly rooted in the way in which they identify with the organization, and as a consequence, the way in which they trust the organization as a whole. So now we are looking for, of course, other also funding, as Stefano asked, but some other antecedents, but also some cross-cultural differences in order to see whether, for example, this works more in collectivistic culture, given the nature of the definition of our ethical climates. But on the overall, we can see that we start informing HR managements and policymakers to suggest strongly that material rewards are not the only benefits that you can use to engage your employees and to make them happy and to make them, healthy and to experience the workplace in a positive way. So we summarized our research line by saying that experiencing your workplace in a very positive way is, a trust-building process guided by social identity concern. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Stefano. And by the way, I think that one interesting possible route for future research could really be, for example, the introduction of aesthetic elements in the workplace, because we know that, for example, some of the companies that have been chosen as best places to work in the past were strongly related also to this introduction of practices. So this could be a fascinating line for future research.
I agree.
Thank you so much, Stefano. Thank you. So now it's the turn of Luca Corazzini from University of Venice.
Yes, I'm waiting for the slides. Yeah. Anyway, so for the moment, let me say that actually I'm a behavioral economist, which actually makes the discussion very difficult because I'm neither an economist nor a psychologist. So I'm something in the mid. But anyway, so I'm Luca. I'm from the University of Venice, Ca' Foscari. And I was trying to understand why Pier Luigi invited me to the conference. But, and I think I came out with a possible answer. It's a combination of two elements. The first thing is that even if I'm not going to talk too much about culture, I'm still interested in understanding how people respond from a behavioral point of view to, some kind of stimulus. So, which I will end up with discussing a bit the cultural nudging. The second element, questo, sì, vabbè. Okay, so the second element why I do think Pier Luigi invited me, it's because actually I'm approaching this discussion in a very critical way. So the way in which I'm going to structure my presentation is to take as a framework nudging, which is something I'm interested in since, I should say, 15 years, more or less. I take almost for granted the fact that you know what we are talking about when we say something about a nudge. But in my specific, interest, I'm going a bit deep in applying nudging to health behavior, which is one of the topics I'm interested in among the others. Among other completely different aspects of my research agenda. And I'm going to briefly discuss the results of 3 studies I did in the past, which was very depressing from the point of view of my co-authors, because I was, in particular, one co-author that is the constant variable in all the studies, because actually I wrapped almost 10 years research into 10 slides. So this, 15 slides, which is, something a bit strange. So, and I'm interested in applying nudging to promote cancer screening, okay? Within formal national cancer screening programs. Okay, so I'm going straight to the three papers, and let me say that I will try to highlight in particular what we didn't expect, the most of the times to be negative results, we didn't expect from these applications. Okay, so the first study, it's in a very specific context in Italy. We are going to work here in the breast cancer screening program, the national program in Italy, but in a bit complicated area, which was the province of Messina. At that time, so the study goes back to 2017. At that time, the province of Messina was probably the most difficult province in Italy in terms of diffusion or promotion of the breast cancer screening program. And so we had this great experience with the local health authority in Messina to try to intervene. No one of these co-authors actually is a medical doctor, so we tried to intervene on the only stage in which we could say something, which was the invitation stage, okay? So I go straight to what we did. Actually, what we are working on is how to try to promote breast cancer screening, knowing from the medical literature that this is a very effective weapon to fight cancer, okay? And so what we did here was to intervene on the letter that women receive every 2 years for the invitation to the cancer screening program, by modifying a 4 lines, literally 4 lines paragraph in this front and back invitation letter. We did it, as I told you, in 2017 over, this a small pilot study was on 6,200 women. And we manipulated these 4 lines according to 2 dimensions. One was the frame of the letter, meaning actually what we did was to either present the possibility to participate in the cancer screening as a good aspect for your health, as a good strategy for your health, or rather to convey the same message but saying, okay, look, if you do not participate, this might be dangerous, okay, this might be negative in a prospective way for your health. The second dimension is what we call cheap information, in the sense that we simply added or excluded some additional sentences that reinforced somehow the tone of the letter by saying, okay, if you do not participate, it might be negative for your health because, it's more difficult to deal with a lately diagnosed disease, and therefore you make the potential treatment less effective, more invasive, and blah, 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 blah. So the idea why we call it cheap information is that because we are not really interested in the informative power of these lines, but more on the enforcing power for the overall tone of the letter. Okay, and of course we have a control group. The control group is simply a part of the population, the invited population that received the ex ante, the status quo letter, which was actually the letter used by the local health authority up to our intervention. And what we find here is the fact that among these 4 different letters relative to the baseline that are given by the intersection between these 2 dimensions, there seems to be one of the letters that is a bit more effective in inducing women to participate effectively to the cancer screening program. And in particular, there is this enhanced loss letter, so using a loss frame enforced by this additional cheap information that increases breast cancer screening by 25% relative to the baseline, okay? Interestingly, we detected a lot of heterogeneous effects, and in particular, the effect of this letter seems to concentrate on those groups of women that would start from, a negative, let's say, situation, for instance, because they live far away, from the hospital, or rather because they never screened in the past, And so, the latter seems to be more effective in, in promoting screening among these groups of women. So the second study is much bigger. The second study is a nice experience we had teaming up with the UNDP and Ministry of Health in Armenia. Again, Marco is still here, and in addition, we have Armenak, that, as you can understand from the name, is Armenian. And so this was very important for us to, keep in touch with the institutions in Armenia. And so in this study here, we concentrate on cervical cancer, and there are some aspects, some institutional aspects that are extremely interesting for us, because in Armenia, the cervical cancer screening program started in 2015, so they didn't have a cancer screening program before, but even better, it was not based on an invitation scheme. So women should know from radio, from mass media, from the doctor, from the GP, whenever the GP informed them about this cancer screening program. But then what happened was that since they didn't get too much coverage for that, the ministry, the health ministry in Armenia, together with the UNDP, started working a bit more about, the information part, so the invitation part. So we teamed up with them. We had this randomized control trial with 36,000 women in the poorest region of Armenia, which is Shirak. So, a context that might be extremely important to promote in terms of cancer screening. And again here, I go straight to the scheme. Again here, we were interested in particular in three aspects that the institutional context, made possible to study. So the first thing is that since there was no invitation at all before, we could assess whether inviting women, could be effective in promoting cancer screening. The second one was again the frame, and here we were interested in two manipulation of the frame, either the negative one we studied in the previous study, or another regarding, frame, so something like, please, participate in the screening program, because apart from the benefit on your health, it's important, for instance, for your family, okay? And the third element we were interested in, the effects of the reminders, okay? The reminders, because we know from the literature that, from the behavioral health literature, that reminders are very, very important. So this is, let's say, a first look of our intervention. We intervened in 2019 between May and July. And for instance, when you focus on Shirak, this continuous line represents the participation rate in Shirak. And you can, see that in this specific period of our intervention, we observed an important increase in the participation rate. In particular, when you compare this this period here with the same period the year before. Okay, so it seems to be, something going on in Shirak. And this gives you, let's say, the unpacked effects of our manipulations relative to the baseline, meaning those women that participated in the program with no invitation at all, with no written reference at all. So we find interesting results. So, inviting women is extremely important. The reminder, so sending reminders is extremely important too. So it increases even further the participation in the cancer screening. But here, the frame didn't play any role at all. Okay, so whatever the frame is, the marginal effect of this frame manipulation was almost zero. Final study that I want really briefly to discuss, because it's a good example how sometimes nudging doesn't work as we expected. So this is another study here for the first time involving people that are actually, physically in the cancer screening. And what we did here was to study in a quasi-experimental setting, and the reason is because they already planned everything. So we were only asked to give some ideas on this, as I'm going to show you information technology innovation, and also to evaluate something that was already administered in this geographic area in the north of Italy. I don't know why, don't ask me why, but for privacy reasons, I can't say where we did it. But anyway, I can show, I'm allowed to show all the results, but I can't say anything about the specific geographic area. So what we did, what we study here is the effect of introducing a web portal which allows women to autonomously change the date of their cancer screening, so the cervical cancer screening appointment. Okay, so instead of in the normal situation, instead of calling the local health authority, or you know what, I have to reschedule my appointment because I have problems or whatever, they can do that by their own, entering the website in a very simple way, and actually presenting a kind of a calendar, like Google Calendar form, and they can reschedule according to the available slots, their appointment in the program. Okay? So what did we get? Well, good results. So 2 sources of good results. First, the web portal was effectively used. So for instance, in this graph here, you see it's a DID format, so it's a diff in diff format. So we are interested in how the behavior of women changed, comparing the situation before the intervention and after the intervention. Okay, so remaining constant, the attitude of women to handle appointments, so to change appointments. What we find is that the proportion of women changing the appointments by phone call dramatically reduced, which actually mirrors the fact that they did it by entering the website, okay? Okay, so that's a good news. Second good news. The second good news is the fact that the portal allowed the local health authority to collect some private information about potential previous appointments, previous screening that they did, for instance, in the private sector. Okay, so there is a bit of an issue that sometimes the local health authority are not really able to collect all the information available on, the screening history of women. With this, with the web portal, actually they managed to collect more information, because women, when rescheduling the appointment, they were also asked, are you willing to share with us, for instance, the date of your last appointment? And they did it. So 2 good results, but then backfire result. So what we find is the fact that the web portal decreases participation in cancer screening. Now, look at this result. On a first view, it might be even positive, right? So, you are fighting over screening, for instance. So, like, I have the web portal, discover that I don't need to screen, so I'm canceling out from the screening program because I already did in the past. Actually, this was true only in part, because what we find is that this sharp decline in the participation is more driven by what we call the unjustified absences. So actually, women that didn't give any particular reason why they were not going to participate. And also among this sample, we knew that the most of them were actually tracked by the public system, so they had to. So, that's a good example of how sometimes, unfortunately, these interventions do not work. Very final word. I finished, Pier Luigi, so don't worry. So, we're studying these interventions to improve, to increase participation in a cancer screening program. What we find is that, for instance, the attention on the frame that the literature is strongly devoted, sometimes our first study seems to be, sensate, but not in the second one. And there might be several institutional reasons why this was not the case. For instance, the novelty. So in Armenia, it was the first time that women received a letter. So it was already very salient receiving the letter per se. The portal, some organizational positive effects, collecting information on the women, spending less time on the phone to try to reschedule appointments of women and whatever, but also some backfiring effect that overall in this relatively small sample, we found a significant decrease in the participation. Now, I want to spend very few words more on some other possible limitations on this kind of approach of nudging interventions. It's a big debate, for instance, the extent to which these interventions continue being, if any, continue exerting positive effects over time, because as probably also our frame attention showed, it's very hard to let people internalize this kind of message conveyed by the invitation. Another point, sometimes I should say that there is a kind of naive approach, so it's something what I would call nudging the nudgers, because sometimes behind what we try to convey as information, as a strategy to the population, there is almost a lot of expectation in the population what this kind of sentences might serve for. And this was the very nice discussion with Pier Luigi, and this opens up a new strategy that I see as a very, very promising, of a kind of cultural nudging, because as Pier Luigi was spending me in a bar discussing about this cultural nudging, so culture is something that can be internalized in a much more effective way rather than, psychological interventions that are the standard at the moment. So, this is definitely something that could be rewarding in the long run, and should make possible to exert effects in the long run, and not only, it is for the moment, being happy for a short run effect, which might be, I think depressing also from a research point of view. Okay, so that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Luca, and I'm inviting Piotr Bialowolski for the last presentation of this session.
Thank you very much, Pier Luigi. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's great to be here. So as you see, I probably gained my invitation by having this paper with Pier Luigi. So today I'll be talking to you about solitary mind games and how they affect well-being and health. So I hope to be short because we are all expecting lunch. So without further ado, I will just briefly scan through the basics. So of course we like leisure activities. As Pier Luigi yesterday said, we as hunter-gatherers even spend time doing things that are not directly relevant to our survival, at least they seem so. So leisure activities are also, so we can do dancing, we can do the synchronized activities, but we can do also activities that are related to our development and related to the development of our brain. So today I'll be talking about the results from the paper. So of course there is this certain ambiguity of these solitary activities because they are very often sedentary. Yes? So you don't want to attract people too much to doing things that are not related to kind of physical activities. But on the other hand, it seems that there is a lot of there are a lot of benefits from activities that involve our brain. So there is evidence that they protect against chronic diseases and they improve cognitive functioning. So what we were working on was the population of older adults, working with the share data. Of course, with older adults, this population is still growing in Europe, and we need to address the issues, how to help them. Of course, they cannot go every day to cultural activities, and we need to find some ways for people to spend and maintain good health, especially mental health. So what we were studying this outcomes. So outcomes from the domain of physical, emotional, health, cognitive impairment, daily life functioning, and also all-cause mortality. As I mentioned, we were using shared data, so this is observational research, but with a very large sample. So we used more than 40,000 individuals to answer these questions from many European countries. We divided activities that you might take into those relaxed leisure activities like reading books, serious solitary leisure activities like solving Sudoku or puzzles, and serious social activities that are related to playing cards or playing chess. As I mentioned, we analyzed a set of outcomes. So with 21 outcomes, we applied for the outcome-wide analysis, so trying to scan through all the outcomes and see what appears to be relevant, not to omit any kind of important findings. Of course, we used various set of covariates, so trying to control for as many covariates as possible, because that's the issue with observational studies, that we cannot conduct an experiment, so we need to at least manage this with controls. The model was simple, yeah, so we were evaluating the mind-stimulating activities on outcomes with a certain follow-up, so with 6 years follow-up, and trying to find for which of those outcomes that I mentioned we've got significant relationships. So what did we find? Yes, just briefly before lunch. Those who read books, yeah, so engage in this leisure activities, they had a lot of positive emotional well-being outcomes. Yeah, so like lower probability of being diagnosed with depression, loneliness, better scoring on the loneliness scale, even though it is a solitary activity. And also with cognitive abilities, we were also managing to find positive outcomes. With respect to those who engaged with the serious solitary mind games, we found also positive outcomes in terms of depression, in terms of well-being, and also lower risk of death. What was interesting? So I will just mention a bit, say a few words about those serious social mind games. So we also had, so here, of course, the subjects were less exposed to loneliness, because if they are playing games, chess, cards, of course that's natural that they become less lonely. The only counterintuitive finding that we found was increased risk of cancer, and that brought me, when we had this finding, it brought me immediately to my high school times when I was playing bridge, and it was pretty intensive usually, long evenings playing bridge, and usually with some older people who were smoking extremely heavily. So maybe that was that's the reason why we've got, for those engaging in this serious social mind games, this increased risk of cancer. So as for the conclusion, just not to spend too much of your time before lunch, we studied mostly the quantitative impact of engaging in these activities. So we checked whether people were engaging for not at all, sometimes, or very often. What we are probably missing, yes, and what we should probably explore is the quality of those activities. Yes, so whether people, when they engage, what kind of what can we expect, and that's probably for the future. Yes, what we'll try to analyze. But for today, so I don't want to keep you any longer before lunch. So thank you very much.
For this impressive self-discipline, I would say, and thank you for that. No, I would only comment on one thing. It can be surprising to think that people reading books feel less lonely. But in fact, if you consider the fact that, of course, reading books often is reading fiction, and literally you have let's say, a parasocial link to the fictional characters. Of course, this is also yet an indirect but very interesting confirmation of the fact that really reading is something that really connects you to your own fictional world, or as also Vittorio was saying at the beginning. Okay, so we deserved our lunch. Thank you.